Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Julie Hennrikus, who is a person who wears many hats. Julie is an author, she's a podcaster, and she's the executive director of Sisters in Crime. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So am I. So give the audience an idea of what Sisters in Crime is, where it came from and what it is and what it does for us.
Sure. So Sisters in Crime is an organization that was founded in 1986, became an organization in 1987. So we're coming up on 40 years. It started in a conversation in the bar at BoucherCon, which is a huge conference. Sarah Paretsky and a bunch of other writers got together and said, women are not being supported in the crime writing community. How can we change that? And so there was a woman named Dorothy Salisbury Davis created this core group that included readers, librarians, booksellers, and writers. And a year later, they founded Sisters in Crime. So Sarah Paretsky was our first president. Since then, we have almost 5,000 members now worldwide, 50 plus chapters throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. And the idea was, and the initial mission was, to support and promote women crime writers and advocate for them. We've always been an advocacy organization. In the last few years and forever, we've expanded that mission to include other underrepresented voices. So what that means is, first of all, it's a community of writers, and you need a community if you're a writer. And if you need to find your community the minute you even whisper aloud that you want to write. People don't understand that, how helpful it is. We offer webinars and other ways for folks to learn and to develop their craft and to have conversations. And we continue to advocate for writers. I'm very, very happy at this point to be the executive director. I've been a longtime member of Sisters in Crime. I was on the board of the New England chapter for many years and very active in that chapter. And I was on the national board for 5 years. So I know the organization well, and I'm thrilled that at this point in my career, I'm sort of taking my arts management skills and, my love for Sisters in Crime and able to do this job.
And one thing, when you talk about advocacy, that is so important. It's easy to stand on the outside and throw rocks and say, we don't like the way the world works. It's another thing to come together as a collective consciousness and say, we want to make our lives better. How do we do that? And to me, that is so important because we find our true natural gifts when we're coming together to work together rather than to work against. So that is one of the things about Sisters in Crime that is so beautiful to me. And then, of course, it's not only women. I'm a sister in crime, which is a nice thing because it's an inclusive organization. And that I cannot trumpet enough because it's amazing.
Well, it always was inclusive as well. It always, from the very beginning, men were invited to join the organization. As I said, we have other marginalized voices that we've been, I'm not going to say paying more attention to, but also trying to lift up in different ways, especially the last few years. But this isn't an issue for one community. Even if we focus on the binary, lifting women writers up, that's not one person's or one mandate. That encompasses a lot of different things. And advocacy, I was into arts advocacy for a long time. I've been into it. I worked in theater for many years, and advocacy isn't political. Advocacy is saying, we're against book banning.
Yes,
AI
yes.
is scary for writers, this, and the way Sisters in Crime actually became relevant was, instead of just saying things, they did things like created a monitoring report where they counted how many uh, reviews were in different newspapers and things. Now, this was 40 years ago. It's in a completely different world now. But they would, people would say, that's not true. And they would hand the report and say, actually, it is true. So what can we do to change it? So the founders and the presidents and the boards of this organization have constantly been thinking about, how do we make it better for everybody, but how do we especially focus on on issues that some people just assume are done, but they're not.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great part of life. We have to be active, mentally active in making sure that we do lift up, because when one succeeds because we've lifted them up, we all succeed.
That's
And
right.
it's so important. So I will tell you, because I don't think when I saw you at VoucherCon I had chosen a chapter, but I ran into Nancy Cole Silverman at an Orange County chapter meeting, and she's like, Dan, we meet in your backyard. They meet instead of Sherman Oaks, they meet in Studio City. She's like, you're a fool if you don't come and join us. So of course I did. And then she was kind enough to ask me to join the board as a member at large. So I'm very proud of that as well,
That's wonderful.
because it's about helping and serving and doing the right thing. And I'm very excited about it.
Well, they're lucky to have you. And board service is one of the ways that people can get involved. Writers tend to be more on the introverted side. So if you can serve or be on a committee or help at registration at an event, whatever you're going to do, it helps break the ice so you can meet other people. But board service is so important. And so thank you for doing that. It's a great chapter, growing all the time. And the thing about Sisters in Crime is, when you join, you aren't immediately put into a chapter. And you could join as many chapters as you want. And so many of the chapters are now virtual, partially or completely, that there's really a potpourri of, places or people you can get to know, or networks you can build by joining chapters as well.
And I agree with you. I tend to be very outgoing, or at least I present as outgoing, but sometimes I can be very shy, especially if I go into a situation that I don't know. And I thought, if nothing else, I can always unfold and fold the
Yeah.
chairs, because that does put you in touch with other people. You have to meet other people, and that's the goal in building my writing career.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what? It matters. Having somebody to fold. You and I have both done events many times.
Yeah,
It's like having somebody you can rely on to fold the chairs or check people in, or help
just
is
the small things.
just. I'm forever grateful to folks who help help the whole thing work.
Totally agree. Now I want to talk about your amazing podcast, which I will put a link in the show notes. So I told Julie before, and when I met her in person and before we recorded today, that my hat is off to her. It is a master class every single episode.
Oh.
So I'm going to use your phraseology. So when did you decide you wanted to be a podcaster?
Well, Dan, this is actually a pretty interesting story. Sisters in Crime has a trademark name and, everything else. And there was another Sisters in Crime podcast. And so we reached out to the lawyer, and the lawyer said, unless you have your own podcast, this isn't, we don't have a lot to work with. So that was one of the things. And I just started as the executive director of Sisters in Crime. And of course, the conversation is about, who could host it and stuff. And I said, I would love to host it.
Nice.
I would love I love talking to people. And also because I'm constant, board members come and go and things. I thought that was going to be what we did. So we started with talking and it's I only interview members of Sisters in Crime. And I mostly, and you and I've talked about this offline, I ask the questions I want answers to. And people are so gracious. And I will say, especially the crime writing community, people are so giving and willing to. And, when I reached out to Charlene Harris, she was so grateful to be asked. She's Charlene Harris. I mean,
You're right.
Thank you so much for having a conversation. But, you just ask people about how they write, when it became an idea, what they wish they knew, how they generate ideas. And I've gotten better at asking bigger questions, or not being afraid to say, so are you a plotter? How does this work? Nobody does it any one way or the other. There's no right way. And I think I, as the person doing the interviews, always come away inspired, or smiling, or having a moment where it's like, oh, thank you for this great conversation. This was fabulous.
And I find that most authors are very generous. And a great thing about doing a podcast, it's a one-on-one unless you have two authors at the same time. But, when you ask someone a question one-on-one, they're much more willing to answer than, say, if they're sitting on a stage with a whole bunch of people lobbing questions. So I think that you and I shared the same thing, because we get to be a little spoiled, because we get to talk to people and pick their brains and ask them, if you have someone like Charlene Harris, who is as successful as she is, there must be at least one nugget of information she's going to give you. And you and I know it's going to be a bucket of nuggets.
Yes. And I think one of the things that we all need to remember, and I need to be reminded of all the time, is that persistence is how you stay in the game. And that it unlike any other field, the arts, and as I said, I worked in theater, so I've had this conversation with a lot of people. It's not a ladder that you keep walking up and hitting a next step. And it's not like being a lawyer where, you pass the bar and then you do this, and then maybe you become partner. And if you don't, you jump to another ladder and you do, that's not how this works. This is a roller coaster ride. And it's going to stop when you're upside down. Sometimes you're going to go backwards. You're going to feel like throwing up, or you're going to be really excited. And sometimes all of those at once. So you have to buckle up and stay on the ride. And I love talking to people who've had long careers who will say, and then the series got canceled, so I did this. Or, it's very, very, very rare that I'll have a conversation with somebody who'll say, and then it was happily ever after. And even folks who've had a long running, Laurie King, her first wonderful Mary Russell series, is what, 30 years in print this year, the first Mary Russell book. But she'll also talk about, writing different things, or figuring out, how she's sort of navigated a career and kept herself interested and involved. And, she's written several other stories. Her series is one of my favorites. So I enjoyed talking to her too. I find it, we all need to be reminded that we're doing something that's hard, that 95% of the people who say, I want to do this, never do. And so the fact that you're even doing it means that you've succeeded. If you're writing, you're a writer. When you're published, you're an author. They're two different journeys. So don't do this to yourself. Don't say, I'm not a writer until I'm published. That's not true.
No.
If you're writing, you're a writer.
That's right. And the thing is, it's a business, and I think I talk to so many people who say to me, I don't like the business side of it. And I can understand, if you don't do accounting, most people don't want to even balance their checkbook. I've done accounting for so long, it's natural for me. If I didn't do it, I would be very lost without it. But I also understand that that's business. You have to be on top of business. And I did a short con workshop where somebody asked one of the facilitators how they kept their manuscripts. And he said, in a drawer, in a file cabinet. He's like, I have a dedicated file cabinet, and everything I write and send out for publication, I make a note where I send it, what date I send it, when I'm supposed to have an answer by. He's like, it seems like a lot of work. He said, but I'm never curious because I open the drawer, I pull out the folder, and it's all right there.
Mhm.
So what he did is he created a system that made it easier for him. If you're a person who's a collector, Julie and I both are, we have to be careful that we keep our stuff in order because we're a collector of things. So I have to have a shelf of future authors that I've already said I would interview, because otherwise I'm digging through a stack of books wondering where in the hell is that book at. It's a business thing, and you got to do the things that make business enticing for you and interesting for you. And if your way doesn't work, going back to community, ask another author what works for them, because they
Mhm.
will happily share their formulas with you.
You're so right about the business, and there's so many ways to be published now. You can be indie published, you can go the traditional route. There are pros and cons. There's ways to make sure that you are well published, so that you don't you're presenting, having a website up and all those things. But Dan, I'm going to circle back to one of the things you said. We were talking about before we went online, I still teach arts management to theater students, and most of them are theater minors. They might be accounting majors or something. This is a passion, but they're not
Sure.
sure. And one of the most important things I do is I teach artists how to budget, because you can't have dreams unless you get a plan. And so the author side of you needs to have a plan. And that plan can involve, I'm going to get a website up and I need to pay for this, or I need to do that, or I'm going to go to 3 conferences and it's going to cost this much money. And this is what I want to get out of it. Or I'm going to have, business cards, even if you're not published yet. I'm going to have business cards I can hand out to people, and I'm going to make sure I meet 10 new people while I'm at that conference if you're very shy. And so the plan part for the business side of writing is critical. I am also going to say, sort of in keeping with the conversation and what you do, for marginalized voices, it can be harder. And I wish that wasn't true, but and I think it's getting easier in some ways, but we need to make sure that it is not a flash in the pan. It's a trend that continues. So, which means we all need to read widely, and we need to buy books or ask
Yes.
librarians to stock them, or whatever we can do to support voices that you may not have read before, or that we need to really embrace this and support other folks. So, but just because it's harder doesn't mean it's impossible. And there's so many great groups who are also supporting other voices in different ways. Sisters in Crime is, of course, a great writing organization. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But queer crime writers, crime writers of color. There's a group called Disability in Publishing. So it's for publishing professionals to talk about disability. These are all other organizations that can also, if you're a reader, you can also go and get newsletters so that you can help make your reading list wider. But attention must be paid, and things don't just happen. You need to help make them happen. But lifting up other people, as you said so eloquently before, doesn't mean there's enough for everybody. And you have to believe that, it's not pie.
Right.
There's enough for everybody. And I think it's a really exciting time in publishing, but we need to, if we don't focus on this, that could go away, and that would be a shame.
I totally agree with you, Julie. I think that, for every stride we make forward, we have to still keep pushing, because
Mm-hmm.
I don't subscribe to we make one stride forward and 2 backwards. I don't believe that. I think publishing right now is rich and diverse.
Mm-hmm.
The number of things that I get sent to me or proposed to me is simply amazing. And I love that. And I love the fact that, I'm a shopper. So every time I take a trip, I look for the independent bookstore. I found one called The Writer's Block in Anchorage. and I bought 2 books that I have never seen before and probably would never see here in Los Angeles. One of them maybe, the other one maybe not, but it was something. I also helped an independent bookstore. I also widened my mind to read some things that I would not have read had I not seen them on the shelf. And I feel like I do my part in supporting, because it is important. It's important to know what every voice sounds like.
Yeah.
And it doesn't hurt anything. And God help you if somebody says to me, I don't read. I'm like, then you have to go away. Or I give them books.
But I've become a huge audiobook fan, so that there are other ways of getting stories. So I think that's another exciting part of this. But you're so right. Go to those independent bookstores. And if suppose you don't want to live like I do and have, piles of books all over the place, buy a postcard from them, buy a pen, like buy a cup of coffee, do something to support them, go to events for folks. I mean, it's one thing to go to a huge event, but it's also, go to the event of the new author who you may not know, but just to support them. Lift people up, use your social media. It doesn't matter how big you are, how small you are, just like I was going to say retweet. I don't know that Twitter's where we all want to be. But there is still a writing community on Twitter.
There is a writing community in Twitter, and I get as good of engagement from Twitter as anywhere else.
That's
so
right.
I have a hard time moving away from it, because I also, with 140 characters, I don't have to listen to too much conversation if I don't want to.
That's right. But there's also Blue Sky, there are Threads, there are Instagram, there's lots of places. I'm trying to figure out TikTok, but I need some help on that.
So, I'm going to shout out not a nice thing for TikTok. I love TikTok because I can make 100 videos. That's very easy for me. The fact that I can't put a link in there drives me insane. I'm like, how could I not link to my YouTube? I mean, it seems like a standard basic thing, but they're having none of it. So
yeah, it's an interesting, but this is, being part of a community means being part of a community, and and it is fun. And I will say, if you're a crime writer and listening to this, it's a great community. I think we address a lot of our issues by what we write, so that we don't, we're very nice in person, because we just collect people and stories.
Right.
And,
We've already beamed them in the head with an axe and a book.
That's right.
In person, we're just going to have a drink and talk about it.
Exactly. Or you're just going to be talking to a terrible person and just taking notes.
Precisely. I agree with you, Julie. I can't say enough nice things about the crime writing community. It has by far been the most inclusive of all the genres, and I'm not making fun of any other genre, but the crime community seems to have a place for everyone and willingly accepts everyone. And that's a really big deal when you're a podcaster.
Yeah. Yes. And again, thanks to you for doing the podcast and for being another way that voices get heard and information gets out there. But writers can be shy or feel like they're shy, but I'm sure you've had this experience. There's nobody who, once you warm them up, you can't have a good conversation with them.
I remember fairly early on, an author said to me, I've never been on a podcast before and I don't know what to do. And I said, just buckle up, dude. I know what to do. I will make you talk. And of course I do, because I describe my podcast as like a barstool story, because I just simply want the person and I to have a conversation about, if it's the weather, about a book, what they wrote, what they're doing. It's supposed to be fun. It's certainly not a grilling thing. It's a fun thing for me anyway,
Yeah.
And
well, I appreciate what you do. I'm going to pitch 2 more things that Sisters in Crime does. We've got a couple of things coming up. We've got a November marathon. In January, we're going to have a January jump start where we have a bunch of write-ins every day and we can help people do things. We have the Eleanor Taylor Bland for Emerging Crime Writers of Color Award. It opens February 1st. It closes March 31st, and it's for somebody who is new and an emerging writer of color, crime writer of color. It's a $2,000 award. We also have the Pride Award for emerging LGBTQIA plus authors. That is open from June 1st to July 31st. So that will open again in 2025. Again, it's a $2,000 award from Sisters in Crime. And it's just a way to sort of lift up, promote, and recognize some of the work that people are doing. So those are two of the other things that Sisters in Crime does. But we, have webinars every month. We have a lot of ways of supporting. But again, I think that if we're all intentional about how we support and who we support and what we're doing, that's important. Part of the conversations we're having is about how to write characters who don't have your lived experience, but to do it well and authentically, don't cause harm, do research. And that's all so important, and a conversation that isn't super new, but it feels like we're having it more and more. Like, don't think about stereotypes and, don't do that. And if you don't know something, or if you haven't lived that, ask people who have and make adjustments based on your conversation. Don't assume you know anything.
Absolutely. And, when we talk about community, that is something that I've seen several times. I was recently asked to be a sensitivity reader about a particular subject that the author didn't feel she was 100% clear on or comfortable with. And it was a great conversation. And of course, it makes me feel good because I was asked, to be a sensitivity reader. It's an invaluable thing. And there's so many in our community that are willing to be that person. Absolutely. And to help someone else. And just can't get enough of that.
Absolutely. And it's when I say do no harm, that sounds, but it's actually so true. A stereotype or something that isn't, that doesn't have that thought behind it or that attention to detail can cause harm. And asking people to be sensitivity readers and remembering that you may need to pay them. Yes. Or you should plan on that as you're doing your budget, like we were talking about earlier. That should be part of your budget. Is that pay people for their time.
Absolutely. I have a dear friend who is kind enough to read things that I write, and I'm always very appreciative. But I also understand that it gives me a responsibility to make sure that I pay that back, either to my friend or pay it forward to someone else, because it's, it is a community. And this is something you ask on your podcast to everyone that comes on, how important is community to you? And we've been talking about this. It is so important because writers get in their head, because that's where their ideas come from. But we have to have community to get out of our head and to share with others and to learn from others. It's so important.
Well, it's so important for all of those reasons. It's also important to have a community of writers if you're a writer, because the people in your life don't understand what you're doing. Sometimes they can be upset because you're actually, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm writing. And, what do you mean? Why are you spending time in a room without me? And writers understand that. And writers can both support you when you get bad news and also kick you in the butt when you're wallowing. You can run ideas by them and they can give you others, or they can tell you, I have a friend who just sent me a 4-page, like, this is what I'm thinking. Can you tell me what what your reaction is? Happy to do that. Right. So you have to find your community, and it has made all of the difference in my life. Some of the dearest friends I have are friends I've met through Sisters in Crime or through going to a conference. And I could not be where I am right now without those people. So please don't try and do this alone. You're going to think it's a solitary activity, but it's not. It takes community to get published and to just, not even publish, just to kind of keep going. So find your people.
Totally agree. Totally agree. So I did not ask you this. I didn't prompt you with this earlier, but so one thing that I love that you ask most of your guests is, what's the best or worst advice? So what's the worst advice you've heard from any of your guests or that you got yourself?
Well, I think the worst piece of advice, and I'm reiterating what so many of the people on the podcast have told me, there's no one way to do this. So if somebody says you have to write 100 words a day or you're not a writer, no. Some people, their lives don't support that, right? I mean, there are people who have small children or busy jobs or whatever. So you do need to build a habit and you need to take it seriously, but there's no one way to do this. And so and the minute you say to yourself, I want to be a writer or I want to write a book, is when you start. Don't set, benchmarks for, well, once this happens, I will go to a conference. And it's like, no. Find people right away. So I do think anyone who tells you this is how you have to do it is not giving you the advice. Also, and I know this is long-winded, how it worked for you at one point, it may not work the next time. So I have 10 published novels. I have several novels in the draw. I'm wrestling right now. You and I were talking, you write short stories. I've written short stories. I think they're the hardest thing in the world to write. So anyone who tells you, oh, short stories are an easy
write a short story, it'll be easier.
No. Every time I start a short story, I start a new novel. It's like, it's the hardest thing. But if short fiction is your jam, do that. Like there's no, there are no rules here.
There's no right or wrong way. Each of us, just as each of us look different, we have a different way to approach writing.
That's right.
So Julie, do you have a website or a social media you would like to share?
Well, sistersincrime.org is the website. And if you have, at Sisters Sync National, SINC National is, on Blue Sky and Threads and Facebook and on TikTok. And so please join us and, reach out to me if you have questions or anything else. But Dan, thank you for all you do. But thanks so much for having me on. I love talking about all this stuff.
I enjoyed this so much, Julie. It's an education once again.
Well, and as I said, every time I talk to somebody, I learn something new and I get inspired as well. So it's been wonderful.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out with Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.